Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is
Alison Landsberg. I'm a professor of history and cultural studies at George Mason University.
many thanks for being with us, Prof. That's great. Now, is that backdrop really your bookcase, or is it one of these faux backdrops such as the one that I have?
It's actually my bookcase. It was a COVID project, actually, organizing this little mini study that I have at home. But it ended up being I think, quite an effective backdrop for Zooming. I have
Absolutely.
had I've had more than one student actually ask to use my backdrop for interviews and other types
Ah,
of
well, there you go. Yes,
yeah.
because on the one hand, it looks very real because some books are at slightly odd angles and so on. On the other, the colors come across so well that I thought it might have been a photograph.
It's just a very small space, so I'm very close to the books behind me.
Just as well you don't live in a seismically active zone, Prof, because although they
Right.
look like they might be attached to the wall, those bookcases.
Um, they might be. My partner might, when we were putting them up, might have done it. I don't know if they're actually. Luckily, we don't live in an earthquake area
Right,
as
right.
of yet, but anything is possible, of course, with climate change. So.
So I'd like to begin more formally by asking you something that I pose as a query to all my guests, which is to ask what's currently, hola, ¿qué tal? Provecho. Dynamizing, impeding, preoccupying, interesting you. What's going on for the prof?
I would say that given the complexities and difficulties of the present, I find myself seeking alternative alternative worlds to inhabit. And that's the sort of fancy way of saying that I like to be captivated by books and television shows that remove me from the world that we are inhabiting right now. In fact, I find it basically impossible to sleep without being immersed in some kind of televisual or fictional novelistic drama that carries me away, that allows me to inhabit somebody else's existence for some time.
And can you give us the scoop on what's currently doing that for you? Maybe there'll be some good tips that'll be handy for the rest of us.
I don't know. I've been quite taken with on the calculation of volume, that it's I think 6 or 7 part novel by by the novelist Solveig Bailey. I'm not sure how to pronounce her name, but it basically is a woman. It's the story of a woman who is trapped on November 18th, and the day continues to repeat. And it's a kind of meditation on time and on living. And over the course, they've not all been translated, so I've only read the first four um, in the series. But it's a wildly imaginative engagement with the problem of time. And this protagonist who is perpetually stuck in November on November 18th, over the course of these of her experience of this, devises different ways of managing and thinking about and theorizing, understanding how to live in this sort of stuck position, and how to add mobility to a life that is otherwise a kind of fixed and stuck life.
Wow, sounds fascinating. So there are six out and
There
four
are
available in English.
four have been translated into English,
Mm.
and I'm not sure if there are three more or two more.
Three more.
But yeah,
Mhm. Excellent. Well, that isn't entirely unrelated to some of your research, actually.
no.
Because I'm in the global south, because I work here, I don't have access to most of your work, but I have access to some. And I should say to people that rather wonderfully, your book, Prosthetic Memory, is available legitimately free online, which is not the case with lots of things. Prosthetic Memory. That takes us back a long, long time, Prof, over 20 years to when it came out. It's a fantastic volume. I wonder if you could run through, if you can remember it, prosthetically or otherwise,
Mhm.
work that it does, and what might seem different to you today.
Sure. So I began working on prosthetic memory when I was a graduate student, and I was interested in a couple of different kinds of things. I was interested on the one hand in um, affect, the way that memory has a powerfully active dimension and an embodied dimension. And I was interested in the possibility or impossibility of transferring memories, bodily memories, over time, over generations, and how that might happen. And at the same time, I was learning about film and cinema. I had not come to graduate school with a pre-existing interest in film and cinema. I was not a cinephile or anything like that. But I took a class with Miriam Hansen my first trimester in graduate school, and it really changed the course of my interest, my life. It was a really dramatic experience, and um, I became incredibly interested in the power of film, audiovisual media more generally, because of their complex mode of address, because of the way that they touch spectators, engage spectators in a multi-sensuous and often complicated way, and with effects that I think can be ambivalent and unknown ahead of time. So anyway, I was interested in audiovisual media on the one hand and on the problem of memory on the other. And I began to theorize what I call prosthetic memory um, by thinking about by basically arguing that as a result, the sort of unintended consequences of two simultaneous developments, on the one hand, modernity, with like radical disruptions of traditional modes for passing on group memory because people were sort of moving all over the place and not living in sort of their traditional local environments. Um, that there were some of the traditional mechanisms for passing on group memory had been disrupted on the one hand, and on the other, the birth of mass culture made possible the wide circulation of images and narratives about the past. And so I argue that with cinema, at the turn of the 20th century, it became possible for people to have an intimate engagement with pasts and narratives of the past that were not properly their own. And because there was a kind of affective experiential dimension to this, I call these memories prosthetic memories.
At the conclusion of the book, it's a book where there's a constant struggle, seems to me, between pessimism and optimism.
Yes.
You show some optimistic tendencies of yours about the internet. And you say, whilst this is a capitalistic project, nevertheless, it is permitting the publication of a multitude of authorizing perspectives on past, present, and future. And that you see this as something with potential in a liberatory sense. And in other work you've published since, you've talked about some changes in your thinking over time about memory. Are you as optimistic as you were when you wrote the book? And what's your view of the internet in general terms today?
Um, so I've been, I've had to go back and think really hard about where I saw the potential in film and television, in these sort of traditional media for the kind of creative work that I was interested in. And I think it's important to say, I think you're right to point out that there is a kind of optimistic, I would even say utopian strain in my writing, which I really do credit to Walter Benjamin and Siegfried Kracauer, who were major intellectual inspirations for me. Those two guys were um, German Jewish intellectuals living in Germany in the 1920s and 30s. Benjamin associated with the Frankfurt School, Kracauer sort of in the larger circle. But both of them were very interested in thinking about um, thinking about the new visual technologies of modernity and what opportunities and challenges they opened up for for people. I mean, they were living during a time of crisis, the rise of fascism, and yet they were interested always in trying to imagine how these technologies, these visual technologies of modernity, photography, film, might change the way people see, change the way people think. And that there would be, it's easy to see the problems, right? It's easy, and people, I mean, they're the next generation of Frankfurt School theorists, Adorno and Horkheimer, were very clear on the dangers of what they called the culture industry, right? The idea that mass culture was always going to reproduce the logics of capitalism. It was barbaric. It was creating passive viewers who take on passively dominant ideologies. And I'm interested in Benjamin and Kracauer, and I've been inspired by them because they understood that, but they didn't see it in such monolithic terms. They saw the dangers associated with capitalism, capitalist logics, and the way that these media um, were inevitably going to be connected to that system. But they didn't think that the outcomes, the products of the audiovisual products would necessarily work only to reproduce those logics, that they might produce other ways of thinking, that they might produce forms of consciousness, right? That they could help the masses, in their words, to see the world differently, to see the world as it actually was. And so for me, their work has always been incredibly inspirational and has led me to pursue academic work and projects that don't exclusively take the form of critique. I think it's really the world is in shambles. It has been in shambles. There's devastation everywhere. And so it's understandable that a lot of academic research scholarship takes the form of critique. But I've always been interested and inspired by those guys who also were living during a time of absolute sort of devastation and barbarism and wanted to think about alternatives and wanted to think about an otherwise. And so my scholarship has always had that sort of, I think, utopian vein in it as well. And I sort of teach my students that as well, that I think it's important, it's been important for me to be able to try to theorize and otherwise how things might be different. And it's frankly, swimming against the current, and that's always been my style. I acknowledge that for the most part, mass culture has wrought, a lot of has reproduced, dominant narratives, reproduced dominant ideologies, but I continue to maintain that because of the very powerful audiovisual mode of address, the way that narrative works in audiovisual texts, and forces viewers to inhabit positions they might not otherwise inhabit, there's the potential for there to be some kind of provocations in audiovisual audiovisual text that can work in unexpected ways. And I think, and that's, this is a very, very long way to get back to your question about the internet. And I'm a lot less sanguine about the internet than I am about traditional media. And I think that's because I realized that part of where I was locating a lot of the what I saw as potential in the sort of filmic and televisual narratives that I have analyzed in the various books that I've written, um, they come from the fact that viewers can be positioned in very intentional ways in relation to the unfolding material. And that's the power of narrative, right? Narrative, um, and it's also connected to film form, the way that editing works, the way that point of view is structured. Um, Viewers can be forced into uncomfortable viewing positions, positions that they wouldn't naturally inhabit. And I think this is less the case on the internet. I think that a lot of videos circulate on social media. They're not intentional in this way. They're not narrative in the same sense. They're not, viewers see them as themselves. Viewers encounter these videos that circulate as themselves. They're not being placed in relation to them in sort of intentional ways that can be provocative necessarily. Um, so that's one way in which I think, I mean, there's a lot to be said. I mean, I have students working on micro dramas. There's a lot of, the internet has opened up other sort of potentially narrative modes. But in terms of sort of like the vast, quote unquote, marketplace of stuff that's circulating out there, I'm much more sort of skeptical about its ability to sort of to produce the kind of provocations and confrontations that I've been interested in my own work on more traditional media.
Can I ask you about another book that came out 10 years after your first? I don't have access to it. We just don't, our libraries don't buy books in English, really, and few journals.
I'll
Engaging
send
the
it to you.
past.
Happy to send it to you.
Oh, Engaging the Past, Prof. A wonderful title. Can you share with the group, as we might say if we were in therapy, about this volume? And by the way, I should say that it is heroic to remember things you wrote 10 or 20 years ago. I do admire it. So thank you for that, because when it came to your first book, I definitely read that more recently than you did.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So engaging the past, basically, as I said before, one of the sort of through lines in prosthetic memory was the role of affect, the fact that audio-visual media sort of touch viewers in a kind of personal way. And it made and the kind of intimacy of the audio-visual mode of address, I think, poses interesting questions and problems for the project of history more generally, because history has always, as a discipline, is really invested in a kind of critical distance from that which is being studied. That there's a sense that in order to sort of to properly consider the past, one needs to be distanced from it, whereas in audiovisual engagement with the past, like on, history on film or on television, or at experiential museums, the whole idea is closeness. The whole idea is proximity. And so I wanted to engage with this sort of problematic that most ordinary people who are engaging the past in their daily lives are doing so by watching film and television and learning about it this way, which is very different from the way that historians would want their readers to encounter the past. They would want their readers to encounter the past, as a sort of foreign country, right? As Lowenthal famously said. So I was interested in the role of affect, and what I basically tried to argue. Again, you'll see that there's a somewhat utopian stream here. in the work, I was trying to argue that certain kinds of audiovisual texts are able to engage viewers with what I described as affective engagement as opposed to identification. Because the big problem, I think, with, audiovisual history is its tendency, these sort of historical films and television shows, a tendency to try to induce viewers to identify with characters in the past in a very facile, simplistic way, right? And this is why most scholars, reject or think critically about popular history, right? Because there's a very strong tendency to sort of foster simple identification, make viewers feel complacent. Oh, I saw this film about, the Civil War. I know all about it, whatever. So, what I wanted to suggest is that, yes, that's obviously one of the main things that happens, but it's not the only thing that happens. And because of the complexity of audiovisual media, they do have the capacity to manage much more complicated engagement with the past for viewers. And I was interested in particular sort of formal strategies, even within sort of mainstream film and television shows, with the capacity for much more complicated modes of engagement where a text will in certain moments draw the viewer in and at other moments sort of pop them out, right? That there are these sort of strategies of distantiation that force viewers out, that shock viewers, that force them to sort of like reckon with this sort of contradiction. And so I was interested in this particular mode of address, an oscillation between drawing viewers in and pushing them out, that I think is really important for the acquisition of historical knowledge, right? That you're thinking historically. This is what like, R.G. Collingwood suggested a gazillion years ago that historical thinking requires one to understand that they are thinking historically, right? Reckoning with distances, feeling stuff, but like interrogating it. And so I basically in that text looked at different sort of strategies that I was seeing in certain films, in television shows, and in what I was calling socially conscious dramas, and then also reality history TV shows, different techniques for forcing viewers to encounter contradictions, to reckon with contradictions that enable them to be able to sort of think critically and in more complicated ways about the past.
This calls up for me the realist text debate of the 1970s, starting with Middlemarch and George Eliot, but moving on to a Marxist British miniseries on war. And in that debate, you get Colin MacArthur taking the socialist realist perspective on how to generate radical thoughts in the audience. Colin McCabe taking the modernist perspective, which is that you must create distantiation, ostranenie, incomprehension, puzzlement on the part of the audience in order for there to be a radical transformation, not dissimilar to the idea of the Adorno and Horkheimer generation looking for how the modernist subject could be cultivated through address as opposed to the one accepting what's there in front of you. So I wondered, do you have a take on that now? It seems as though you think that these things can actually perhaps operate together. Is that fair to
I
say?
do. That's very fair to say. And in fact, I mean, my current research project is sort of continues in that vein as well. So I'm definitely happy to talk about this. I think it's precisely that. I mean, I think that that these texts need to do both. I think that and that's why I think, that's why I continue to be interested in audiovisual media, because I think that that yes, obviously they are under the control of, these media conglomerates, right? And who have a profit motive, and in general, they work to reproduce the logics of the capitalist system. I mean, there's no doubt about that. So that's not at all what I'm challenging. But I do think that within given text, there are strategies that I think that it's impossible to fully control the meanings, right, of these texts. And so, like, I mean, sort of in the vein of Jameson, I think that these contradictions inevitably find their way, contradictions of the present inevitably find their way into every text produced in a particular historical moment. And but I guess getting back to the question of form, I think that I'm interested in the kinds of texts that speak to like the masses. I'm not interested in like art cinema. I'm not interested in film that only sort of intellectuals will see and think about. I'm interested in television shows and films that, large segments of the population see. I think they have the greatest potential to have some kind of social or cultural impact because of their, mode of address. And I think that I've been interested in those texts that do sort of combine realist aspects with other kinds of strategies, either through anachronism or like in engaging the past. I am interested in the biopic as a genre because of the way that all the time viewers are reckoning with the fact that the person that they're seeing is an actor playing the person that they know, right? So there's that sort of built-in sense of distance, right? So that like, for part of it, you're sort of caught up in the drama that this is actually that person, but then you're aware that actually there's a layer of mediation. And being aware of the layer of mediation, I think, is really important in sort of like, I think, reminding people that this is a representation of the past, that they're thinking sort of historically about this person. This is not actually the person, right? And so like the sort of insertion of mediation, of a reminder of mediation is really important. And there are different sort of, I think, audiovisual strategies for forcing viewers to understand the mediation, right? And that's one of them. In the chapter on reality history TV shows, I don't know if you're familiar with any of these, but the BBC did several of these shows where people from the present are taken back to an earlier historical moment where they're supposed to sort of live in a reality history TV way in the past. So, like in engaging the past, um, I analyzed the shows. One was set in the colonial period, one was set on the frontier, and the the shows I think are meant to be entertaining because they're meant to sort of show viewers how how difficult the past was, and to sort of bring to light, I think, the difficulty of assuming that you could sort of simply know what the past was like, right? And in one of these, in I think it was Colonial House, the settlers, they're being sort of like plunked down in, I think, in Maine, and they encounter descendants of an indigenous community, and they're sort of, members of the indigenous community sort of are not happy to see them, and they sort of suggest that this is their land, and it's very awkward for the colonists. These new colonists, they are, their sort of liberal selves feel like, oh, I'm not in favor of, imperialism. I'm not, and yet here they are sort of participating in this sort of recreation of this sort of imperial moment. And I think it's really instructive for viewers, I think, because one of the things that we as intellectuals, we think it's a sign of intelligence to be able to hold contradictory ideas at the same time, right? So like for these participants in Colonial House to think that on the one hand that they believed in sort of the promise of America and, liberty and justice for all on the one hand, and to be anti-imperialist on the other, actually you can't really do that, like that this there's a fundamental contradiction here. And I think that, one of the sort of really powerful outcomes of this show is to sort of bring to light that fundamental contradiction, right? That it's not possible really to sort of think of America as a land of opportunity and freedom and also acknowledge its creation as a kind of part of an imperial project, and so I think that like really productive kinds of thoughts are sort of produced for viewers as they watch people grapple with these contradictions.
Now, Prof, one of the things that you've written about more recently in a bravura co-authored piece is the idea of meta-modern memory. And you're talking here about the various versions of Blade Runner. It's increasingly hard to know what Blade Runner is, given director's cuts and so on. But could you take us on a little tour d'horizon of meta-modern memory?
Sure, absolutely. And I need to say, of course, that this was a project that was undertaken in collaboration with Timotheus Vermeulen, who is a good friend and colleague who's at the University of Oslo. And he and I began working on this piece a really long time ago. And he is one of the sort of the original theorists of metamodernism. And basically, what happened was we had both been invited to give talks at a conference in Norway, and that was when I sort of first encountered his ideas about metamodernism. And I was on the plane home, and I watched Blade Runner, the second Blade Runner, on the plane, and I just hated it and was so depressed because, as you may remember, the original Blade Runner or the director's cut or whatever cut, most every cut of Blade Runner, was really very radical, especially in its depiction of memory. And I didn't mention this when I was talking about prosthetic memory, but I used the films Blade Runner and Total Recall in the book Prosthetic Memory to theorize like the sort of taking on of someone else's memory and to sort of I think explain how there can be a progressive dimension to this to prosthetic memory, because in both and I guess this is something I didn't say earlier either, like the metaphor of the prosthesis is really crucial to me, that like calling those memories prosthetic was a way to signal the fact that they're not natural, right? They're useful, right? They help a person do something that they wouldn't otherwise be able to do, help them to see something they wouldn't otherwise be able to see. But you're never confused. Like if you have a prosthetic arm, you don't forget that you have a prosthetic arm. You know that it's not natural, right? And yet it becomes part of your body and you use it, you know and that was sort of the spirit in which I was imagining prosthetic memory, not appropriating someone else's memory, but borrowing it, using it in a way that enables you to do things and see things you wouldn't otherwise be able to do, see, or think. And so Blade Runner has this very radical account of implanted memory, right? That it's on the basis of these implanted memories that Blade Runners are able to, ultimately gain empathy and fall in love and, save, at the end, Rutger Hauer saves Harrison Ford, the Blade Runner, and he falls in love. Deckard falls in love with the replicant Rachel, and she says, I don't, there's a very powerful scene where she's playing piano in his apartment, and she says, I don't know if these memories are mine or Tyrell's niece's. And Deckard says to her, you play beautifully, right? So the idea is that like what she's doing with these memories is more important than their authenticity, right? It doesn't matter where they came from. What matters is how they're being used. And so it really disputes the idea that memories have proper owners, that they belong solely or exclusively to someone, right? And it opens up the possibility that memories could be shared and borrowed across categories of difference. And so it was really fundamentally anti-identity politics in a way that I thought was really constructive. And when I was watching this second version of Blade Runner on the plane, I was so upset because it sort of undid all of the radical potential of the original Blade Runner. Because in the second Blade Runner, basically it's the opposite, that there is this like one authentic memory of a child in an orphanage, and the whole plot, I don't know if you've seen this film, but what motivates the whole plot is, there's a Blade Runner, and he's comes to think that this memory, they're looking for a child basically who was born of a replicant mother. And he comes to believe, this Blade Runner, that he's actually that child. And so he's trying to verify the authenticity of this memory that he has. And that motivates the whole narrative. And ultimately, it turns out it's not his memory. And he has to give this memory to the person it belongs to, and he dies. So it's exactly the opposite of sort of the understanding of memory that happens in the first Blade Runner. And so Timotheus and I, in sort of thinking about what this tells us, is and thinking about this version of Blade Runner as a metamodern version, as opposed to sort of the postmodern Blade Runner of the 1990s, 1980s, is really very much connected to sort of the media environment of the present, right? That it used to be, like when I was writing prosthetic memory, it was possible to sort of think about viewers encountering the same texts, right? Because there were fewer networks, fewer everything, right? Like you could assume that like a big sort of blockbuster film or television show would be seen by a lot of folks. And we live in a very different media environment now that's incredibly siloed, and there's very little sort of crossing over, very little encountering other people's memories, right? Prosthetic memory was predicated on the idea that you might encounter something radically different from yourself, right? And that could be productive, provocative in the sense of making you think, and then productive and forcing you to challenge your own understanding of the way you see the world. And we thought that this second Blade Runner was very much connected to the current media landscape, where there is very little crossing over, where people watch the kinds of shows that reinforce and confirm their own worldviews and aren't really forced to sort of take on and encounter other people's pasts and histories. So, I mean, the point is not that prosthetic memory is no longer possible. It's just that the media landscape has made it much more difficult because of the siloed nature of reception on platforms, and the way that people encounter and consume media has changed so much in the contemporary landscape.
By the way, just en passant, I'm reminded of the fact that in your first book, I don't think many people saw this film, but it's possible to read about Ralph Fiennes as drug addict and drug dealer.
Right.
And listeners who only know him as M in James Bond movies or quasi-romantic lead really should take a look at your book and it's strange. I think it's Strange Days, right? Film.
Not strange. Which one?
The Ray Fiennes film where he's the drug dealer that you write
Oh,
about.
yes, yes, yes,
It's called
exactly. Yes,
Strange Days, I think, right?
exactly.
Yeah,
Yes,
I'd
yes,
urge people to go and watch it because A, you can see why he was briefly thought of as a popcorn star, just
right,
and before Alec Baldwin got a little different in his voice and body shape. You could see what Hollywood thought it was doing with Baldwin. You could see what Hollywood thought it was doing with Fiennes. And now
right,
here he is wearing braces and sitting behind a desk, in the Bond film.
exactly.
But it's a very interesting film because it, in a sense, brokers some of this space between the original Blade Runner and the later Blade Runner. And there is
Right,
a certain customization to the idea of being able, as an addict, to buy something that has a
right,
guaranteed effect on you,
right,
but is also about memory. Yeah, that's what I think
right.
you're working with in the first book, the prosthetic memory book. So
Yes,
interesting.
yes, exactly. I think that's exactly right. That's that sort of transitional moment there. Yeah.
So, Prof, I have one last question for you, if I may.
Mhm.
And when I've asked you that and you've answered it, I wanted to give you the opportunity to add anything you might wish. That could take the form of something entirely new, or it might be going over terrain we've already covered. Right? And my last question is about your essay from a few years ago about Get Out, Jordan Peele's film, and the idea of what you're calling horror verite. And I wondered if you could share with us a little bit about that piece and your view of that important film.
Sure, thank you. This I think gets back to the discussion that we were having a little while ago about realism and anti-realism and the way that they might be sort of constellated together within a single text. I think I was really struck by the ambitious nature of Get Out. And on a most sort of basic level, I was interested in the use of tropes and conventions from the horror genre to expose and make visible like everyday horror, right? That we might not ordinarily see, right? So that the film was very effective at using um, you know, surprise and jump starts to try to sort of get the viewer on edge to sort of question the things that they were seeing that might be kind of off. And so it's using horror to expose everyday horror that we've become kind of inured to. So like that's sort of like the idea of horror verite. But I think the film does way more than that. And I think it's kind of one of the things that I sort of argue in that piece, and this is sort of continues into the book I'm working on now, is that it's also a meditation on the power of the camera and on film to challenge the way we see and think about the past and its relationship to the present. It doesn't seem at all incidental to me that in the film, the protagonist, Chris, who is going for the weekend to his white girlfriend's home in upstate New York, he's African American, he's a photographer. And he always has he always has his camera with him. He's taking photographs. He gets the sense that things are kind of off at their house, and we see him looking through his camera. And it seems to me that this is exactly what Walter Benjamin was trying to theorize as what he called the optical unconscious of photography. That photography as a technology might enable us to see things that are not visible to the naked eye. And he meant this both literally, because we could see sort of movements that are not really visible. Like if you're watching a person walk, like they're in these sort of strange positions. If you freeze the image, that we don't see with a naked eye. But he also meant it, I think, much more metaphorically, that the parts of our world that have become second nature, that have been reified, we have new purchase on when we see them through the camera lens. And I think that Jordan Peele is really sort of experimenting with that idea, is trying to make that idea visible. I think it's particularly noteworthy that it's the camera, it's Chris taking a photograph of this other guy who had been captured by the family and undergone the Caligula procedure. That when Chris takes a photograph of him, it breaks the trance, right? That it's the technology of the camera that actually break, breaks the illusion, breaks the trance. And it's a moment when Chris comes to consciousness about what's happening and the audience comes to consciousness about what's happening. And so there's a very compelling account here for the power of film and photography to change the way we see and change the way we think. And then like the other really dramatic thing that happens in Get Out that I think is really important, and that's again like the use of the sort of fantasy and the real. Like we come to realize over the course of the film that this garden party that is being held at the home of Chris's girlfriend, Rose, it's actually an auction, and Chris himself is being auctioned at this garden party. And so what we're seeing in this scene is quite literally a modern day slave auction, right? It's a black person being auctioned to an audience of white people who are going to use him for some reason to enhance their own wealth, life, whatever. And the film, I think, sort of creates this incredible, I call it like a dialectical image in the way that Walter Benjamin describes, where the past and the present are sort of like brought into a constellation with one another. So that in this sort of like, you know, in the sort of contemporary, supposedly liberal New York, you could have a slave auction. It's a sort of shattering image. It's an image that, like, I think is shocking to the audience when we see it. It challenges the idea that there has been, linear progress in the U.S., right? That it challenges the sort of historicist notion of, you know, positive change over time, progressive history, linearity, by sort of holding the past and present into this sort of fixed relation to one another that forces us to rethink the way we see the present, right? And so that's part of the really sort of constructive work, historical work that I think Get Out is doing. And I think that Get Out is part of a much larger body of films and television shows that are taking up sort of racial pasts and racial histories in the US and challenging the historicist mode of history writing. And this is what I'm writing about in my book, Impossible Histories, right now. So that will be a sort of a piece of this book.
Fantastic. And to conclude, Prof, anything you wish to add? As I said, it could be something we've already touched on, where you want to say something else, or it might be entirely new material.
I mean, I would just say that I would just sort of reiterate my point. I mean, I think some people might read my work and and wonder why it is that I am always trying to imagine an otherwise, to think about more positive outcomes. And I think it's really the only way that I can see to move forward. I mean, I think it's sort of it's incapacitating to not work to try to think about how how things might be different. And because I focus on film and television, I'm really committed to trying to understand and theorize how these media might continue to be a tool to to raise consciousness, to help people see differently and to think differently about the present and the future.
Well, many thanks, Prof. It was terrific learning from you today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you.